interesting. So as again, tonight we are speaking English, and we try to interview the interview in English and Cantonese for every 2 weeks. And then, so even though Hana speaks perfect Cantonese, so we are interview her to speak in English. Hong Kong is an international city, so I guess a lot of people are bilingual, such as Hana, sorry. And then, we speak in English today. And as usual, my name is Axel, and then we have a Xiu Xu in here. And then our major interviewer is Carmen. So I would like Carmen to do the interview now. Thank you.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you again, Hana, for being our guest today.
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to be here.
And I have to say thank you to you for writing your book, For the Love of Hong Kong, because it's a very short book, but it's a very, very powerful book. I cannot tell you how many times while I was reading it, I have to put it down and wipe my tears. So it's a great book. I recommend everyone to read it if you're interested in what's going on in Hong Kong. But Hana, let me ask you the first question. You have a very, very unique upbringing. Not only were you raised in a biracial and bicultural household, but you have been surrounded by key figures and activists in Hong Kong's fight for democracy since you were a baby. Was it difficult for you to explain what you're doing in your personal life outside of school to your friends?
I think that's a very interesting question. I don't think that as a child, especially growing up, that I ever thought that there was anything unique about, my parents, what they did. My godfather is Martin Lee, and like what all of that meant. And I think I was very fortunate in the time frame. I think I was raised in Hong Kong as a young kid and as a teenager that, it didn't matter the way it does today, what maybe your parents believe, what you believe as politics. It was much more, you were yourself first, at least I found in my school. And politics, you could disagree, agree. I remember like umbrella movement happening in 2014, and we would disagree with each other, my friends and I, make a point in favor of the protesters, someone would make a point against, someone would agree with me. It didn't matter the way that it does right now. And I think we had a great privilege in that ideas of sort of kind of democracy and of just freedom of speech and thought, and that like we all are entitled to our own opinion, was something that we were very privileged to have growing up. And so I don't think I ever consciously had to explain what it meant that my family was very involved in Hong Kong politics. I think it was much more just like that. My parents did that. Someone else's parents were doctors. Someone else's parents, sold cars for a living. Like that was the way it was. And I think maybe that's a big difference between the kind of childhood. You could be a kid in my school, a 15-year-old in the school that I went to nowadays, and you would not have that experience. And I think that's something that we're going to really just keep seeing moving forward, that there is this kind of generational rift, that people who kind of were born and raised in the era of Hong Kong with free speech and freedom of assembly and thinking and democracy and all of this human rights as almost a given, are going to stand on a different kind of threshold to people who maybe are being raised now. And I think that's a really scary thought, that, it's a different place to grow up in today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So in the book, you mentioned a little bit about why you decided to write the book. And you said in the book, and I quote, "To be honest, when I was first approached about this project, I was scared. Not because I doubted whether it was something I wanted to write, but because I was afraid that my criticisms of the new law and the new associated policies would seal my fate and prevent my ever being able to return home. Still, to decline the opportunity to contribute to my beloved city the way I know best felt like a betrayal. Can you elaborate on that? And now that the book is published, did you regret the decision to write it?
I mean, the short answer is no. I do not regret writing this book. I think something that, still is unclear, I think, to a lot of people is that the vagueness of the national security law means that really anything you say could make you guilty, but also there's no bounds to really what falls into that category. And so I think, I think writing the book was very cathartic for me personally, and I'm really happy and very happy that it resonates with other people. I think it's another kind of element of that had me a bit worried that probably still, whether or not I had written the book would be impacting my life is the notoriety that my parents have as kind of pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong. And I think, I can't change what they're doing. I wouldn't want to change what they're doing. And so that also played a factor in the kind of, I guess, nervousness I had approaching this. But it felt like something that was, and I think I say this in the book at some point, that it was both like the easiest and the hardest thing that I've ever written, because I think it's so easy, especially living abroad these days, to really just try to mash down the feelings you have about Hong Kong, because it's like a Pandora's box. Once you open it, it's like, I'm sitting there like crying in my bedroom. And so it's trying to figure out how to tackle that. And I think the process of writing that book was very therapeutic for me in that way.
So you compare the protests in Hong Kong in 2019 and 2020 to the book series and the movie series Hunger Games. But you said, unfortunately for Hong Kong, no Girl on Fire, Katniss Everdeen was there to cushion the fall. I found that comparison very, very interesting, because although there was no one girl that is center stage, the female protesters definitely play a very visible and important role during the protest. What do you think about that?
I think for me, the comparison was more born from the almost kind of parallels between the dystopian authoritarian nature of the government in this book series and the government in both Hong Kong and mainland China. And it was a book that, I was obsessed with as a teenager. And so it struck me in that way that there was, so much fiction and nature, kind of reading out there about the exact situation that Hong Kong was going through and is still going through. And in all these books that you read and movies, like, someone is saving the day. There is usually one person or a small group of people that's out there, bow and arrow in the case of Katniss Everdeen. And it really just struck me at the time, and continues to really just humble and awe me, that Hong Kong's, at least 2019, 2020 kind of fight really didn't have a protagonist. And yes, there were lots of women involved. There were lots of images, of couples and families being at the protests. And just, I think, the imagery and the experience of the protest was something completely unprecedented for the city and like really for the world. And I think that comparison doesn't diminish, the role that feminism and female protesters and even icons play in the movement, both icons, in their 20s and 30s, but also icons, like my godfather. But it was really just that, like, there was such an anonymous element to the Hong Kong protest of recent that really just something completely humbling and completely just, awe-inspiring, that no one was trying to really be the hero, that everyone was collectively the hero. And like, maybe there really was just one hero because the Hong Kong people were together, that person.
Right. So
I have a side question.
Yeah.
I'm just out of curiosity that, when I saw the Hunger Games, the three finger salute, and then, I feel quite awestruck at that time back in 2014. I was wondering, does the three finger salute come from the teenagers at the time or come from the adults at the time? I'm curious, that only.
I think the three finger salute, which again was used in Hong Kong, and I think in some of, I don't know exactly, but I think it was used in Thailand as well in protests recently, that it's such a sign of solidarity, the way that, the Milk Tea Alliance, again, is this great symbolism of people who are from different places, have, otherwise different experiences as people. And so I think the three finger salute really was just, it was a sign that everyone, was there together. And I think I think it was really interesting that it was seen in Hong Kong at that time. And it was, again, like associated with something so, fictional and seemingly far-fetched, but then somehow also extremely relevant.
Mm-hmm. Right. So this protest is, I think we would all agree, powered by young people. And your generation is dubbed Generation Hong Kong. What do you think, what is this Generation Hong Kong? How is it different from the generations before it and the generations after it?
I think it's one of the few generations, if not, probably the really only, that was raised in a completely kind of democratically inclined Hong Kong, is one way of thinking of it, that the generation HK that I kind of refer to is the people or the kids who are born in, around about the handover time. So, in the 90s and like early 2000s. And I was born in 1998, right after the handover. And it's this feeling that I was not alive in a British Hong Kong and have really no memory of that transition, but was raised in a city that valued things like democracy and rule of law and, the right to vote. And it wasn't, I think that's a big difference. And I think, previous generations really fought for us to have that privilege as children growing up. And I think my generation really rides on the shoulders of everyone that came before us and all the kind of talks of democracy leading up to the handover and the Sino-British Joint Declaration. But I think there is a sense that combined among all these generations, and I think especially around, when things started feeling like they were going south, 2014, 2019, that this feeling of like a Hong Konger identity that was so tied to the freedoms that we were experiencing and, the ideas of democracy and, human rights that Hong Kong had at the time and that we were really just raised in. I think that's perhaps the distinct point in the generation that we had that maybe separates, the late teens and early 20s from other generations.
Right. So in the book, you included quite a few conversations between you and Brian Leung, who is also in your generation, right? He's also 20-something, born and raised in Hong Kong. And he mentioned a little bit about what his political awakening is like. So you are obviously from a different upbringing, from most other teenage this generation in Hong Kong. But among your friends, do you see this kind of political awakening that Brian described?
I think, I went to an international school in Hong Kong, and the school had a mixture of audience. It was not very expat heavy, but more kind of local elite. And it had an interesting experience where people's families, at least I felt like in my childhood, didn't necessarily come to dictate what their kids were thinking. And that, like, we had, when they were proposing the national education in 2012, my school's human rights group, which was student run and student led, or student founded and student led, hosted a complete session that was really almost to show us, or show the entire student body, how dangerous the national education curriculum would be to the students. And they did it through the form of a simulation where they pretended it was a thing, and then at the end said how bad it was. And so I just went to this, it was like this extreme moment where everyone, you know, could think and be who they wanted to be. And, you know, the politics, I think, were really present in our classrooms, that you would have events where people would come in and talk. Like Benny Tai came in and spoke to my school once, and people would come in and, you know, share their political beliefs. And if you disagreed, you disagreed. You didn't have, it wasn't really, it was a respectful disagreement. And I think part of that was just that everyone, regardless of what maybe the political beliefs that they had or that their families had, kind of felt like this sense almost that there was, I think, a unity in society, in a sense that, you know, democracy was something that kind of people felt like was around the corner. And that, you know, the freedom to discuss things and the freedom to disagree was something that we were all entitled to. And so we would have debates like in history class, you know, Chinese class, English class, where we were talking about Hong Kong's politics, talking about the umbrella movement. And it's really striking again to me, talking about generations in Hong Kong, that that's just not something that could ever happen anymore in a school setting.
So in the book, you mentioned, so you spent a lot of your childhood on the campus of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I am an alum too. So when I was reading how you describe the battle on campus, it was like really, really heartbreaking. So you were not in Hong Kong during that time when the protest broke out on campus. Can you describe a little bit about when you have to write about it? How do you feel? Like, what struck you the most while you're writing about it?
About CUHK? So to be very honest, I was in seminar I was in the human rights program at my school in the U.S. And I was in a seminar at the time, and we had our laptops open, and I just had the Twitter basically live stream and the SCMP live stream of what was happening in CUHK on my screen. I have no idea what happened in class that day. And there was a moment where the hashtag, I guess, Tiananmen 2.0, I think, was trending on Twitter, or at least trending in whatever part of Twitter I was in that Hong Kongers are part of. And I literally, like, I stepped out of the classroom and I was just standing in the hallway crying. And it was a completely heartbreaking moment. And I think, you know, there's something about seeing a place that, something about it being CUHK campus that day versus, obviously Hong Kong means a lot to me. There's plenty of places in Hong Kong that feel like home to me, plenty of streets, plenty of neighborhoods. But the place that I was born in, and my first home ever, kind of falling under fire and looking at, you know, kind of tear gas canisters and soot stains, fire stains in the swimming pool that I was taught to swim in. And, you know, could remember eating Chang Fun next to the pool, or going to get like Schweppes grapefruit soda from the canteen above. And just like a place that I could so picture in my mind and just know exactly what it looked like, and seeing it transform so much and really feeling so helpless from abroad. Honestly, it's something that I hope people don't ever have to experience, because it was such a heartbreaking moment, and I don't really, it's, yeah, I mean, it's something that will always, you know, bring a lump to my throat when I think about.
Right. Yeah. So, in the book, you mentioned something about keeping Hong Kong's identity and its story alive. And I think it is something a lot of us overseas Hong Kongers have been thinking about, like how do we do this? What, as a overseas Hong Konger yourself, what do you think are the things that we can do to keep the story of Hong Kong alive?
I think that's a big question. I mean, one thing, I think it manifests in different ways for everybody, which I'm sure everyone agrees with. But, you know, for all, you know, when my mother is home, she plays RTHK all day, every day, basically.
Right.
And it sounds exactly like my childhood apartment growing up, which RTHK was also playing all day, every day. And so I think for some, it's staying up to date with the news. For others, it's staying in connection to Hong Kong communities, staying in connection to the language, to the food. But I also don't think that the Hong Konger identity was ever just, or is ever just about, you know, Hong Kong as a race or as an ethnicity or as even just a specific place. It's about this kind of collective feeling that unifies people who identify with the struggle and identify this kind of, you know, incredible time and place that we grew up in and have connection to. And I think there's lots of elements that contribute to that. And, you know, I don't think I will really ever do anything. I've been kind of working on grad school applications right now, and, you know, it's almost impossible to not have Hong Kong be a part of that. There's nothing really I will ever do in my life, I think, that doesn't try to weave Hong Kong into it as a story and as a narrative. And, you know, I feel like a lot of people feel the same way, whether it's class papers or it's, you know, career paths or hobbies you're doing on the side. I think it's about everyone doing, you know, what they know best and can do best to try to keep that alive, and sharing the stories of your childhood and of your, you know, whatever connection you have to Hong Kong, however small it may be, to, you know, people who care and will listen, because I think it's honestly hard to not sympathize with what's going on and what has happened to Hong Kong.
Right. So I know you have been in touch with some of the protesters, young protesters who are overseas now. For example, Nathan Law, whom went to school with you for a while at Yale. Are you also in contact with other young protesters? And do you know, like, if they are planning anything, like, because there has been also the idea of like a government in exile floating around before. So from what you understand from these protesters in exile, do you imagine something like this would happen?
I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. I think there's so many people, regardless of, you know, notoriety, like Nathan Law, to just, you know, people who've recently moved abroad for their children's safety and their own safety and future. I think there's such a range of Hong Kongers that are just now in different, especially Western countries. And it's a precedent, you know, that has been set by Xinjiang and by Tibet and, you know, other places that have fallen under fire in this way. And so I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. There is, you know, a refugee flag and refugee, you know, Olympic team organizations and all of that out in the world. And I think there's a very strong community among Hong Kongers abroad and among people who have had similar experiences. I think it's I've just, slowly been witnessing classmates and friends and, others that will take to studying refugee studies or things like that because it's something so directly important to Hong Kong. And and when I was an undergrad, I took lots of classes on kind of exile and migration where we read memoirs. And I think there's lots of elements and lots of ways I think people can help. And you can even see by the fact that so many organizations have started since, 2019 happened, including, this organization. But so I think it's possible. I cannot give, a set answer for that, but I think it's a really interesting question, and it's definitely a precedent that's been set before.
So you have been a journalist before, and you wrote this book. Do you have any plans to continue to write about Hong Kong, either like in a book or something else?
As I said, Hong Kong will never be far from what I am doing. I think everyone here can agree that that's pretty much impossible. And I think that I don't currently have a book planned or anything like that, but I do hope to keep writing, and I hope to keep bringing whatever I'm doing, or bringing Hong Kong into whatever I'm doing, because I think that's really important. And I think, that's one way of keeping the story alive, both for myself and just, for people around to learn and experience as well.
So I know it's going to be difficult to choose, but I'm going to ask you to choose. What is the one thing that you miss the most about Hong Kong?
I think I would normally say food. However,
any particular kind of food?
I think I can't even pick the type of food. It's literally everything from the bak choy from a Dai Pai Dao to whatever bao is being sold on the street, or the chong fun that comes in the white plastic bag with the paper inside, and the tea mahjong and fasting jong and everything. But I actually, the other day, I was just scrolling through Instagram, and just, a random Hong Kong photographer had posted a video series of sounds of Hong Kong, and it was things from, people arguing on the street, to mahjong tiles, to the MTR sound, to just, cars honking and everything. And I think that's probably the thing that I miss the most, because it's such a unique soundscape that Hong Kong has. And I think you can attempt to recreate food, is how I'll put it, but there's no way you can recreate that soundscape.
Yeah. I think in the book you also mentioned smell is another thing that is really unique about Hong Kong.
No, absolutely. There's just so many random smells that I think something that always struck me, I think especially coming home from college, was just landing back in Hong Kong and smelling the kind of exhaust fume and realizing that I really felt an affinity towards the exhaust fume. That I almost missed the kind of the petrol mixed with extreme humidity that you experience coming out of the airport, where you almost have to brace yourself because it's so thick outside. But then you're there and it feels comfortable, because it reminds you of home.
Yeah, because it's home. I am going to open up the floor for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I think Anna has a question. She is joining us. Anna, you have a question?
Hi. Yes, this is Anna. Would like to thank you for contributing to the corpus of research and comments and all that. And obviously we came from the same place, but you came from an era much more interesting than the one I left it from. And, I think I can hear you allude here and there during your speech just now as in, whether you think that fight, so to speak, should go on and how it may surface itself, right? Understanding that we are the, as the hostess actually puts it, overseas Hong Kongers, right?
Yeah.
At the juncture of a very interesting era, we almost want to draw parallels between, the lack of human rights and the diminishing scope of rights in Hong Kong, as we also witness, among girls in Afghanistan. Right, and comparing that with the North American or the Western world landscape, right? When like you came from that place and you have colleagues of similar age groups, which I no longer belong to, right? What would be your advice to them? As in, how do we, first off, do we keep up with the work? Yes, no, and if they should, what do you think it would manifest itself as, right? Obviously, balancing their, safety and the reality of as to whether that work would materialize, right? Are you going to advise them to keep fighting for whatever core values they believe in? And if you think that fight will still go on, what do you think it would show up as a result, right?
I think that's a good question. I think I think Hong Kongers have always been infinitely creative in how they protest, and even in just the day-to-day how they find ways to express themselves and to survive. And I think that one thing that we're already seeing is how protest maybe doesn't just mean standing in the street waving signs, chanting slogans, or trying to make moves on the political scene. That it can mean writing books, articles. It can mean talking to your classmates, your colleagues. It can mean so many different things that really keep the story alive. And I think it also means a sense of solidarity with others that may be experiencing a similar thing to you. And there was, I think it was the New Yorker, I could be wrong, but an article by a woman who was a journalist fleeing Afghanistan. You mentioned the women in Afghanistan, and she was writing about leaving her home, basically just like leaving work one day, going home and just heading straight to the airport, getting on an airplane and making sure, her family was there, her brothers, her cousins, nieces, nephews, and they were all on the plane and they were leaving and staring out the window that time. And my entire family talked about that article because we were all thinking, that sounds exactly like what thousands of Hong Kongers are experiencing right now as well, and what so many people experienced before this past year unknowingly. That the last time I was in Hong Kong was 2019, and when I flew out, I didn't know that it was potentially the last time I was flying out. And so I think that communal solidarity is one way of maintaining and kind of continuing on this protest. And I think Hong Kongers have always been really good at that you see kind of banners and flags and signs for protests all across the world when you look at pictures of Hong Kong's protesters when they're taking to the streets. And so I think, I don't think it's possible really for the kind of conversations and fights that Hong Kong has been having to just silence up. I don't think Hong Kongers will let that happen. I certainly don't want that to happen, and will try my best to do what I can to make sure that doesn't. And so I think it's really a matter of harnessing everyone's individual creativities. I think to ask people to do things that will hurt them and put them in prison or worse is an extreme task. And so I think abroad Hong Kongers really carry a burden almost of making sure that we're carrying the torch that Hong Kongers in Hong Kong can't really carry anymore.
Anna, do you have a follow-up question?
Well, I think I just want to say, yeah, I think we agree, and I think we'll find our ways to do our part, and how that part looks like today may be very different the next month we talk, right, based on the international landscape. But I think we're all in agreement, all of those who are here in this hallway, in agreement that in some way, shape, or form, we'll have our own strengths to contribute, and we will be willing to do that.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Anyone else have a question for Hana?
Before the second audience coming up, I would like to urge everybody to follow the speakers up there, and then this room also, this club, 又係呢度, and then we will arrange writers and journalists to have a talk about the books and talk about Hong Kong. So if anybody is interested in the new development or the history of Hong Kong, and then please follow the club and follow the speakers up here. And if nobody is coming up yet, I would like to have a question with Hana, is that I've been hearing a lot of people in Clubhouse, they have an experience in 2019, went through the protests, and then it seems that after these 3 years, they have a still strong, vivid memory of whatever happened back then. To me, it seems like they changed their life a lot. And then since you are mentioning that you are applying for a graduate school, I'm wondering, will that experience in 2019 or even earlier, 2014, that change your perspective and change your life, that affect your subject and affect your graduate school selection?
That's a good question. I think, to be very honest, every time I try to write any essay to apply to anything, somehow Hong Kong always weaves its way into it, and I think it's such a core part of my identity. And I think as a child growing up in Hong Kong, I always loved Hong Kong deeply. I loved walking around the city. I would, it'd be August, felt like 40 degrees Celsius, and I would still insist on walking from like Wan Chai to Tai Kung Shing or something insane like that, because I just loved being in the city. And I think that was a very separate love to the love that I feel now for Hong Kong and the admiration I feel for the Hong Kong people. And I think I almost, as a child, took for granted the connection my family had to the pro-democracy movement. It was something I was born into and never really thought twice about as something, unusual. And so I think that definitely post 2014, but especially after 2019 happened, and experiencing really the fall of 2019 from my college campus with a handful really of Hong Kongers, including Nathan Law, on campus, it was a moment where I think the big difference was that I could no longer separate my identity from my passion for Hong Kong and for the values that Hong Kongers stand for, and for, what Hong Kong was fighting for, that if I'm in conversation or an interview for a job or for grad school or whatever else I'm doing in life, and, it's someone that doesn't feel that affinity, like that's not something I'm willing to give up. That's a kind of non-negotiable thing for me, that whatever space I'm in has to be one that Hong Kong's values are also valued, and that there is kind of, a kind of, allegiance with Hong Kong people, if that makes sense. And so I think that kind of being a late teenager and, especially 2019 really shaped that. And I think that, I don't think I'm unique in thinking that way. But yeah, it definitely plays a role in what I hope to study, and what I even just read about. The kind of media I consume these days has really kind of skewed towards being kind of books and articles on people, kind of almost Asian identities, and on peoples of exile and people who, forced into exile, refugees, lots of memoirs out there can give many recommendations. But this kind of feeling of affinity and almost just kind of familiarity that you can find with narratives from people from all across the world.
Great, thank you. I will hold the question for books recommendations later, but I think Yvonne has a question. Yvonne?
Hello, guys. Hello. Hi,
Hi.
Hana. I just want to say I really admire your ability and your talent and your dedication to be the voice of Hong Kong, and I thank you so much. And I haven't read your book, but I would love to, and probably I would contact you about if I have any other questions or insights coming out from reading. So my question for you is if I were in your shoes, I would be really nervous about my own safety or my even I actually kind of know your mother, so I really understand the complication. And it for me, if I were in your shoes, I might be really worry about my own safety and my mother's safety, because when you're in the forefront of speaking up, and you don't know where the red line is. Mm-hmm. So how would you deal with this kind of anxiety, and what would be your next project that you plan to do, your next move?
That's definitely, I think, a fear that is always lingering. My parents both are very vocal in Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement, both back in Hong Kong in years before and recently more abroad, and it's definitely a weird feeling being like, okay, well, we have to cross off any country that has extradition agreements with mainland China if we're traveling anywhere abroad, or there's a lot of thinking and a lot of kind of planning around our future that I just never thought I would have to confront as a 23-year-old. But it's also reassuring is the wrong word, but it's not lonely, I guess, to know that my family is not the only family experiencing this, and that I think it's something that people are experiencing on varying scales who are, have connections to Hong Kong. It might not be so extreme as to worry for their own personal safety, but, a fear of what the future of the city means for work, for, children, for all of that. And so I think there's definitely a lot of anxiety with that, and a lot of just, homesickness that you really can't do very much about except for live through. But being able to talk about it and being able to write about it, I think, helped me more than it could hurt me. I say optimistically. But I think also that knowing, in pondering whether or not I wanted to continue doing this book, thinking about how, to a certain extent, it didn't really matter what I personally did if my parents were continuing to be very vocal, which they are, and I extremely admire them for. I fell into that boat already anyway. And so knowing that was almost reassuring and kind of motivating me to continue doing this. But it's a very weird feeling, and I clearly don't really know how to describe it or talk about it. But I think it's nice, and not nice, again, that's the wrong word, but it's a lot less lonely knowing that other people in varying degrees on, different ends of the spectrum are experiencing similar feelings, and from all parts of the world too, that you're not alone, and that this is, you know, a huge, horrible thing. But people get through it, I guess. And, you know, they've done it before.
Yeah, thank you, Hana. So what would you think is your follow-ups move, like, I mean, your next steps, your next project?
I don't have a concrete answer for that, but I have always loved doing creative things, and part of that is writing. The other part is kind of visual arts, and so I was an architecture major in school. And I think for me, the next project is doing something that combines the visual and the written. And it's something that I hope, you know, can apply and resonate deeply with Hong Kong, but can also maybe reach a larger audience too. And I think there's so much breadth of what you can do when it's in the kind of creative sphere. And so I don't have a concrete answer for you, but I hope to employ kind of both ends, or not both ends, but two different sides of creativity.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Sounds awesome. Keep up your good work.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne. While we're waiting for another question, let me just ask Hana. You mentioned you can recommend some books to us. Can you recommend some books to us?
I think that one author that I think is amazing that you guys had last week is Karen Chen. I think her writing is beautiful, and again resonates incredibly well, and that's in the sphere of Hong Kong. One of the books that I read as a student that I think resonated with me more than really anything I had read until that point is called The Return, by a Libyan refugee named Hisham Matar. He actually studied architecture, but now is an English professor. And his father, I guess, similar to my parents, were kind of very outspoken critiques of the Gaddafi regime. And were forced into exile as a result of that. And his father actually was captured and put into prison and never, you know, seen or heard from ever again. And so The Return kind of, that's the starting point, and it's chronicling this author and his mother and his wife returning to Libya for the first time in decades, and what that feeling is like, and kind of how they piece together what happened to the father. And I thought, I mean, that book is incredible. Anyone looking for a great book, that's great. A good one. I hope you read mine first, but that's a good second one. But
that will be on my list.
It's a really good book. But I think there's a lot out there in the genre of memoirs, and I think there will be more and more. I know Nathan Law is coming out with a book soon, and I think just reading the narratives of Hong Kongers again is really a way to continue the fight, you know, quote unquote, abroad. But it's also just, I think there has been a lot of good journalism coming out of Hong Kong recently too, in the past couple of years, both from, you know, foreign journalists and from Hong Kongers. Another journalist from Hong Kong that I really admire is Laurel Chor, who I think worked for Nat Geo for a while. But there's, I think, a lot of great writing. And I think, especially these days, a lot of it has that kind of tenor of loss that's attached to it, and, you know, kind of what do we do with our lives now. And there's actually there's something that I interviewed Chris Young for my book, who's like a veteran journalist in Hong Kong. He worked for FP for decades, and Hong Kong Citizen News, I think, is what he runs now. That might not be true. But he said to me, I was asking whether he was going to stay or leave Hong Kong as someone who is such a prominent journalist and, you know, hasn't been shy about his opinions, especially about the free press. And he said, you love Hong Kong, but maybe you find that Hong Kong isn't a place worth your love anymore. And I think that's almost the sentiment that is driving so many people broad, but also be driving so much writing and art and creativity about Hong Kong that how do we capture the place that we did love and that was worth our affection, and how do we do that in, you know, whatever way that we can.
I agree with you. Like out of this protests, we really see a new wave of young writers from Hong Kong. I don't know if it's like just solely because of the protests, or if there were no protests, there will still be young writers coming out. But I am not excited, but I am happy to see this wave of new writers, especially a lot of them are writing in English, so that the world knows more about Hong Kong. Yeah.
No, it's really, it's great to see, and it's great to see, you know, publications picking that up too. And, you know, there's like Lausan and stuff that are Hong Kong publications that are doing a lot of great work with journalism, but it's also great to see that, you know, foreign media hasn't forgotten about Hong Kong yet either. And that, you know, it still holds a place at least.
Right. Yeah.
But in the international kind of.
Yeah, I agree with you. Do we have any more questions from the audience? If not, I think maybe we'll give it a few more minutes. Edsel, what do you think?
Yeah. Before any audience coming up, and then I would like to reiterate that to follow this club, 又係呢度, or so that we are trying to find writers and journalists to have an interview with us about their books about Hong Kong, and then that's actually our objective for 又係呢度, to preserve Hong Kong culture and the language. And then also you can follow me, Xiu Xu, and Carmen and Hana. Like for the books that Hana that write for the love of Hong Kong, you can click on Xiu Xu's icon. That is the face of the cover face of the books that Hana write. And yeah, that's about it. And then remember, and then this book show is co-hosted by HKPN and HKBC. And then HKPN is a network professional that help oversee Hong Kong people to set up food in overseas. And then HKBC is Hong Kong Books Curators, that we try to preserve Hong Kong book and culture.
Yeah, I want to give another plug. If you want to know more about HKPN, Hong Kong Professional Network, you can search on Facebook and join the page there. And if you want to know more about Hong Kong Books Curators and the work that we are doing, please follow us, reach out to us, and we can talk more about it.
Yeah, actually, we have a Telegram group. It's called Hong Kong Books, HONGKONGBOOKS in one word. Like if you are in Telegram, please join the group, and then we can talk about Hong Kong books over there.
And how we can save the books.
Exactly.
Okay.
Hi, Hana. Just let you know that actually today is the 31st of August, right? So actually I know most of people know what happened last year today. And I know some of my friends in different cities around the world, they have like a protest, or they go to the streets to memorize today. So definitely we are not lonely. And I think I also watched the interview of you from Think Tech Hawaii. You mentioned there's a concern that you also mentioned this time tonight. There's a totally different classroom settings about how you can talk at school, things like that. Maybe by the time go by, we may forgot, or maybe the children or the younger generation be told the different stories. I totally understand, and we have the same concern. But like you said, I think Hong Kongers is very creative people, so they accept writing. I admire your work of your books, and I'm sure, just like you said, Hong Kongers will just being creative to remember Hong Kong, to carry on their values in the future and outside Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong, maybe the old Hong Kong is gone, but the Hong Kong in our mind will last forever, you know. So I really appreciate, like, you are the younger age, you see things very clear, and you stand out front for the freedoms. So yeah, so I think you are the people that encourage the rest of the Hong Kongers to be encouraged and carry on their life outside Hong Kong. People leave their country is very hard for them sometimes. You mentioned also a similar thing, like homesick and a lot of things to deal with. So that definitely a lot of stress for them. But I think if we have the same feeling that we are not lonely, it will be like have a better and brighter future for Hong Kongers. That's what I want to say. So I'll pass back to Essel. Thank you, Hana.
Yeah, thank you for that. No, I think there's one of my Yale professors, I was talking to her when I was first starting this book, and she said, Hong Kong isn't a place only, it's a happening, a phenomenon. And I think that's exactly what you're pointing to, that maybe Hong Kong that we all knew is gone as a physical location, but there's like a Cantonese soundscape, there's a global Hong Konger identity that is not bound by space or time, and we're all proof of that, and so many thousands of others are proof of that as well.
Yes, exactly.
And I guess that's why 加油 and or become a new word in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's internationally recognized now. So in view of the August 31st happened in 2 years ago, and then I would like to say 香港加油.
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 Yep. So if we don't have any more questions from the audience, I probably would like to close the room. It's exactly 1 hour for the interview, so we're pretty much on time.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, and then I will really like to thank Hana to be here today and then talk to us about her book. And her book's actually a reference. Actually, Hana was referenced by Jeffrey at Weiserstrom. We interviewed him like in the episode 2. Then his book, Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brim, actually talked to Hana, and he wrote about it. And he recommended Hana's book too in our episode 2. Yep. So, if you want to look at the Hong Kong's what happened in the last few years, please take a look about Hana's book. And then if there's nothing else, I would like to close the room in 30 seconds, and then I will see everybody out, and then say thank you for coming up to here tonight actually, for me.
Thanks everyone, and special thank you to Hana for joining us tonight. It's been very educational.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, before you
and
leave
your dog
the room,
didn't bark.
He did not. I have been holding him so that he doesn't.
Oh,
he's in my lap.
Yeah. One last chance, before you leave the room, please remember to follow the club and follow the speakers. And then when we have new interviews, then we will announce in the club and schedule at least 1 week, sometimes even 2 weeks ahead. so that, you don't miss our next interview. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Everyone.
Thanks, Hana. Thank you for joining us, and I wish you a good evening.
Yeah, you guys all as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.